Morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this sixth and final session of the COFEM Knowledge Summit. Today, we'll be talking about feminist approaches to building knowledge and evidence on gender-based violence. My name is Ilaria Michaelis. Next slide, please. And I will be co-facilitating the session today together with Alina. Alina, do you want to quickly introduce yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Alina Potts, and I work at the Global Women's Institute at George Washington University.
Great, thank you so much. And as you can see on the slide, we have two very exciting guests today, Annie Modi, who's joining us from the DRC, and Victoria Namgala, who's joining us from Uganda. We'll do some proper and longer introductions for them in a few minutes. Today, because we have a lot to cover and we want to have lots of time to discuss feminist research methods and challenges with our guests. We won't be doing introductions for all of you who have joined, but we do ask that if you'd like to, you tell us who you are and what brings you here today over the chat, so that people in the room knows who else is joining us today. Before we get started, another quick, just a quick introduction to how the session will be structured. We'll start with a brief introduction to what COFEM is, recognizing that many of you have been on other sessions of the Knowledge Summit, so we won't take too long with that. We'll then talk briefly about what we mean when we talk about feminist research, and then really get into the meat of the session with a conversation and a discussion between Annie and Victoria, who both conduct feminist research in their work in the DRC and Uganda and beyond. At the end, we'll have some time for Q&A, hopefully, from all of you. And for the Q&A session, we will be able to unmute participants if you'd like to ask a question. So if you do want to ask a question, please either use the raise hand function in Zoom, or if you can't find that, just type in the chat that you want to ask a question, and one of us will unmute you. Alternatively, of course, you also have the option to just ask a question by writing it directly in the chat, and we'll do our best to respond to all of them. So we'll get started now. Next slide, please. With a brief introduction to COFEM. Next slide. COFEM, which stands for the Coalition of Feminists for Social Change, is a collective of activists, practitioners, academics, and thought leaders who work globally to end violence against women and girls, specifically in humanitarian and development settings. COFEM was officially formed in 2017, and it was born out of a concern among some of us about a declining feminist perspective in work to end violence against women and girls in humanitarian development settings. So next slide. While we recognize that there has been amazing progress made on how to prevent and respond to violence against women and girls in the last 3 decades, thanks to the work of women's rights activists and women's movements more in general, we've also seen over the last few years a shrinking of the space to do work in this area that was informed by feminist principles. And therefore, COFEM was created to try and respond to these concerns and try to create a space for a conversation that is informed by feminist principles. So I'll hand over to Alina here.
Yes, thank you. Next slide, please. COFEM is infusing a feminist perspective in several ways. One of these is reclaiming space for women-centered, women-led, and rights-driven work on violence against women and girls in both humanitarian and development settings. as well as strengthening feminist analysis in areas like engaging men and boys and ensuring that programming remains accountable to women and girls, and in linking theory and practice through, for example, understanding gender inequality as a root cause of VOG or GBV. And we work with other specialists to ensure that initiatives addressing different forms of violence don't create competition for victimhood. Next slide, please. So we have a number of learning and advocacy tools. One of those is the Feminist Pocketbook, which we're drawing from today. We really encourage you to visit our brand new website, cofemsocialchange.org, to check out all of the different tip sheets in the pocketbook, as well as papers that were developed for the Sexual Violence Research Initiative conference that explore some of these topics more in depth, and videos and lots of other resources. Next slide, please. So what is the Knowledge Summit? Next slide. Those of you on the call may have joined for some of the previous sessions. The summit is 6 online discussions, such as this one, where we're addressing some of the areas of the Feminist Pocketbook tip sheets. Each session has been free and open to the public, and we've also recorded them. So if you weren't able to join live, you will be able to watch them on our YouTube channel. There will be an email sent to all Knowledge Summit participants with the links for these recordings, and you'll soon be able to find them on our website as well. Next slide, please. So today we will be looking in session 6 at feminist approaches to building knowledge and evidence on gender-based violence. And I'd love to encourage you to use the chat box to, again, tell us, it can be 1 or 2 words, it can be more than that, but what is feminist research? What does this mean to you? And encourage you to look at other participants' responses, and we may want to reflect on these later on in the session. But to get us started so we can really get to the part we're all waiting for, which is the discussion with Victoria and Annie, I'll hand back over to Ilaria.
Thanks so much, Alina. So yeah, we're going to get started talking about what feminist research is. And primarily, feminist research is a type of research that both in its methods and in its uses and in its objective is committed to transforming inequitable gender power dynamics and therefore improving the lives of women and girls. You can find a lot more about what feminist research is and what it looks like, especially in terms of violence against women and girls, in the pocketbook tip sheet number 5 that Alina mentioned. But we'll go through some key principles now. Next slide, please. That really define what feminist research is. So in the first instance, feminist research is a type of research that recognizes and keeps into account in all of its activities the gender power hierarchy. So that means looks at how power, status, and resources are distributed unequally between women and men. And in particular, when we're looking at gender-based violence and violence against women and girls, it really considers how the gender hierarchy plays into the dynamics of violence and the responses that are available to women. In order to do that, feminist research builds evidence with women and girls, and this is really critical as a principle. We're not just talking about data collection, so ensuring that, for instance, women and girls are interviewed during the research process, but rather really co-creating research with the women and girls who are affected by the issue that is being studied. And so this means involving women and girls during the design of the research, in selecting questions to be asked, for instance, during the analysis of the findings, the interpretations, and then the dissemination phase as well. So really throughout the process of research, women and girls are seen as much as possible as co-creators of the knowledge products alongside the researchers. At the same time, feminist research also has an explicit objective to use research to transform inequitable patriarchal structures to achieve gender equality. So it doesn't claim to be an objective tool for, you know, just looking at what happens in the world, but rather, you know, and speaking about the reality on the ground, but rather it has a very clear objective in terms of changing social structures and social norms. Importantly, feminist research also adopts an intersectional approach, meaning that it recognizes gender inequality often intersects and combines with other types of inequalities, such as those created by racism, by class differences, religious differences, disability, and so on. And finally, feminist research acknowledges and accounts for the position of the researcher and the position of research participants vis-a-vis the researcher. So it's conscious that there are often unequal power relations between researchers and research participants, and it is explicit about that, and it reflects on how to minimize those inequalities in the research process, but also how those inequalities might affect the findings in the end. So these are the principles. As I said, you can find more information in both the tip sheet and at the end of this presentation, there will be a slide with some more resources and links to such resources that you can avail yourself to, because we understand this is a very quick introduction. But also, and most importantly, we are really excited to hear from our two guests today who will be telling us about their very practical experience of doing feminist research. So I'll hand over to Alina now to introduce them.
Thank you. So I have the honor of introducing Dr. Victoria Namugala and Annie Timoti. Victoria, who also goes by Vicky, is a lecturer at the School of Women and Gender Studies at Makerere University in Kampala, Uganda. She teaches various courses that center gender and migration, health, sexuality, education, and employment. She's also the team leader for an IFAD-funded study titled Challenges and Opportunities for Rural Youth Employment in Sub-Saharan Africa. It's a mixed method study. Dr. Namugala identifies as a scholar activist. She believes in theorizing from lived experience and complements her academic career with working with communities for social justice, and engages in interdisciplinary research around a range of topics in addition to gender-based violence, also on forced migration, forced displacement, humanitarian settings, as well as post-conflict, and has published a book, journal articles, and chapters. And I encourage everyone to look at the reading list for this session. We've included work by both of our guests on that list. Annie is a Congolese activist whose areas of intervention are in the promotion of the rights of women and girls who are survivors of gender-based violence, as well as those living with HIV/AIDS in the Democratic Republic of Congo and in Southern Africa. She is executive director and co-founder of Afia Mama, which means women's health. This is an organization whose primary objective is around eradicating stigma and discrimination for women and girls living with HIV/AIDS or who are survivors, and promoting their well-being. She currently coordinates the Congolese Young Women's Leaders Movement. This is a network of almost 400 organizations across the country that supports young women's integration in decision-making positions, in peace-building processes, and in development and humanitarian interventions at all levels. And she was the capacity building manager for the DFID-funded La Pépinière project in Kinshasa, where she supported the establishment of a girl-led research unit, which used innovative girl-led research methods to generate evidence on the needs and barriers faced by adolescent girls in DRC. Next slide, please. So we've listed here some questions that we love to ask feminist researchers. We realize you may have some to add to this list, but we also want this to be kind of a free-form open discussion, and it'll be a great opportunity to also hear Annie and Vicky talking with each other. So we may not get through all of these, but I'll start off asking you, Annie, what inspires you to do the research that you do?
To do the research that we do as the fact that through the feminist methodology, we are building knowledge mutually with women and girls, and through the process, building the young women's and women's agency by generating most inclusive data, because I believe that young women and women are experts of their own realities, and that inspires me to work with them during analysis of situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Thank you, and welcome into the session. I'm really glad that the connection is working. So let's see if we can get extra lucky. And Vicky, if you're there, please welcome also to the session, and let us know, just to start us off, what inspires you in your research?
Oh, thank you so much. My inspiration for the research I do is really derived from my experience, my lived experience. Yes, I've lived in Uganda all my life, born, raised, and educated in Uganda, and I've seen how women and girls, but also other marginalized groups, how they're misrepresented, how they're marginalized, how they're disadvantaged. Particularly for the northern part of the country, it has been experiencing a civil war since 1986. It's now like, it was declared post-conflict in 2008, but like that's like 2 decades plus. So I've been witnessing people go through all sorts of violence, and the women and girls are particularly affected. So that created the daring need for humanitarian aid and assistance. And that's how I got inspired and interested in researching further what's happening to these communities. And then besides that, there's also the experience I've had through my education. And I realized, especially for my PhD, I did my PhD in the US, and we're looking at theories explaining childhood. And I felt the Ugandan child, the African child, was not being represented in what was going on, which drove me back home to think and see how the definitions like the ICRC, how it defines a child, how children need to be protected, how they need to be provided for. These were things that are not happening to children in situations of displacement. So I felt the interest and the urge to understand further how such children fit into the normalized and universalized definitions that determine who a child is, how a child should be, and the kind of set standard that defines childhood. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Vicky. That's an area of growing interest on the global stage too, the intersections specifically between violence against women and violence against children. So great to have you speak to that. And I see we have, for example, Sophie Namey on the call, who's done a lot around that, as well as others, I'm sure. So I want to just build on that question and ask Annie, you spoke a little bit already about the way that you center your work on women, and particularly you've done a lot of work with adolescent girls. What makes your research feminist?
I think the approach itself and methodology and even the principles that goes with the way I do my work here is that including participants, as we call them, as agents and experts, not just as informants in the process of research, from the design development of the protocol itself, from the questions to data collections throughout to analysis. And also, I believe in what makes my approach feminist is what goes with the mentoring process that takes place. As I was saying earlier, what inspired me was that mutual work that we did, we are doing. There isn't a lot of mentoring that goes on. No, we mentor mutually because we learn a lot from the young women or women that we're working with. And also, what makes it feminist, besides all the research steps that we can think of from analyzing data, we also have the approach of disseminating findings that is totally innovative and different through outreach activities that we do. So this makes us go back, the young women go back with the findings of their research where they've been involved from beginning to the production of findings, to then use the fact as advocacy tools for the social transformation. That approach makes it really feminist, and because it's resulting in real social change and making for solutions that will.
Okay, Annie, we heard most of what you said. The connection started to get a little bit difficult towards the end. But I mean, I know I was like furiously taking notes and trying to write down every word that you said. So just a reminder, we will have this on YouTube afterwards. I really, really love how you brought out participants as agents and experts, not just as informants. I feel like we could have a T-shirt or something that says that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to, please feel free to add on later. I'm going to pose the same question to Vicky, and maybe we'll just check your audio quickly. But Vicky, I'm wondering if you could tell us, for you, what makes your research feminist?
What makes my research feminist?
Yes.
Okay. So there's several, I would say several things that I can talk about in that aspect. But for me, I think it's the intention that I have within me as I go out to do this research. That's really the center of everything that I'll say. So as I go out, I intentionally set out to engage with the power hierarchies within the communities, and even internationally. I try to deconstruct the power hierarchies. For instance, the developed world vis-a-vis the developing world, adults vis-a-vis the children, men, then women, and all that. So I try to break it down to a level that creates a difference within the communities. Specifically, I go for the intra-group differences. For instance, when we talk about women, which women are we talking about? So I try to break things down to really get to how the participants I deal with identify themselves, and then how they make sense of the lived realities that they have. So if, for instance, if the international community defines a child to be anyone below the age of 18, but I'm talking to people who don't even know when they were born, they don't know their birthdays or maybe year or whatever, but they're using events maybe and seasons to try to situate themselves in the growth, in the development stages. So I would prefer taking on what the communities identify themselves to be rather than what is being externally constructed to define them. So when I'm defining a child, for instance, I look at what other scholars, what Mora specifically calls the functional and relational age. Instead of looking at the numeric age of a person, I look at the functions they perform and the relations they make with others and how these define them within their particular local context to tell who they are. So that helps me to have self-identification from the communities and the people that I deal with. Then also, in doing that, I try to center the marginalized. So I try to bring their voices to the center, and the marginalized normally are the women, they are the girl children. So you try to give them a voice, to create a space for them to express themselves, and they bring in new perspectives to knowledge. And by doing that, I'm trying to reconstruct and to try to understand what knowledge is, first of all, and even who can know. Because there's this patriarchal setting that it's the men, it's the elders, it's the leaders that know what the communities want. But remember, this will talk about things from their own perspective and standpoints. They may not really find women's concerns and girls' issues that important. So they won't prioritize them. So by giving voice to these girls and the women, it helps them have what we could call valid knowledge. They're also valid knowers. And I particularly take on that previously neglected knowledge to bring on a new aspect to their communities. There are several things I can talk about. Maybe one that I cannot leave out is consciousness raising, because as we discuss gender-based violence, for instance, as we talk about rape, I make sure I leave the communities at least informed to the best of my ability what they can do if this happens to you. What steps do you take? Where do you go? What what is needed? Because at least they can tell you we go to police, but then by the time someone thinks of going to police, they've already washed, they've showered, they've removed all the evidence. So it makes it very complicated. So at least I create that awareness. At least you share the information that's needed for them to have maybe justice served where it's possible.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vicky. I love how you talked about previously neglected knowledge. Sometimes it's even knowledge that seems like somebody dug a hole and threw it in there and then poured some soil over it. So it really is unearthing and recognizing all of the knowledge that women and girls bring. And I appreciate you highlighting the ways that you do that. And I'm going to now hand over to Ilaria so we get to share how fun it is to interview both of you. So Ilaria, over to you.
Thank you so much, Alina. And yes, also just wanted to say how much I loved Vicky really speaking about your scholar activist perspective and how you combine, both of your sides of your work and identity when you work with communities. That's really great. So our next question is really focusing in on work on violence against women and girls. And we'd love to hear from you both, starting with Annie, if the connection allows. Annie, why do you think feminist research methodologies should be used when we're studying, doing research on violence against women and girls in particular? And if you want to share any examples of how you've done that, that would be also really great.
Thank you very much. I think to answer to the question of why we need to use feminist approach to research is because in my context of work, where most of has been done by only academics and in the traditional way, most of them believing that they're only the ones who have knowledge that matters to transform or to suggest solutions to social problems. in my context has failed us, because from gender-based violence to economic inequality to access to services, the academics research has not really brought about sustainable social change or solutions to the people in the DRC. So why this approach needed to be used in my context is because by working with adolescent girls and young women and women themselves, working for them and by themselves, we've been able to suggest really quality data to the issues that they would not initially open up to. Hello? Hello? Can you
Yeah,
hear
we can
me?
hear you again. You broke up very briefly, but we can hear you.
Can you
now.
hear me?
Yes, Annie, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So the use of feminist approach to research in our context is very important. I will use two examples. We have been having a lot of programs for economic empowerment of women in the DRC. With a lot of donors, it has been failing because part of the problem was the data and the traditional way of information and research and baseline studies have been conducted. Then the DFID, through the Pépinière program, funded for 3 years, we worked with a diverse group of young women. Not all necessarily have gone to school, working like Vicky was saying earlier, that there is knowledge that has been neglected. We were able to understand a bit in depth the causes. This case was a suggestion of work. And today the findings of that research that was conducted by a group of 20 young women, about 30% of which did not go to school, who had to use their drawings, who had to use recorders, to use different means to collect data and different tools to analyze data. The findings is helping now many other programs to facilitate and to empower women economically, from their access to the banking systems to building up the capitals, to transforming the product. So using feminist approach, it's really important for social transformation and practical solutions to people who need it. We're not saying the traditional way of collecting data or academics way is not important, but for social change, we think that feminist approach is very important right now, as it's responding to the need of the participants themselves.
That's
Hello?
one. Yes, thank you, Annie. We heard all of that. Thank you so much. That was really fantastic, and thank you for highlighting how academic and non-academic knowledge, for lack of a better word in this moment, can really complement each other to come up with concrete solutions and promote viable social change. So I'd love to hear now from Vicky what the answer to the same question. So why do you think that feminist research methodologies are helpful or preferable when we study violence against women and girls and gender-based violence?
Thank you. So I think it's useful to use feminist methodologies for a couple of reasons. One is I find it so accommodative. It's accommodative to various understandings and various contexts. So it can be used in various various ways. It gives you the leeway to be innovative and come up with the methods and methodologies that are really applicable to the communities you're dealing with. And then you have the communities involved. It gets participatory. They are creating the knowledge themselves. And so by doing that, it can come up with sustainable policies and frameworks, because then the communities can own the research, the information, the data, all that comes out of the study. It's a true representation. It can be a true representation of what the communities are going through, the experiences they're having. And because it's them, because it's true, it's what they're really going through, it means they can own it. If you
Victoria seemed to have dropped off quickly. I don't know if that's for everyone or just me. Victoria, can you hear us? Okay, we seem to be having some connection issues with Victoria. So maybe we will we'll go back to Annie and ask a final question, and then if Victoria can join us again, she can complete her answer. But Annie, would you like us to tell us a little bit about, very quickly, some challenges that you have faced when doing feminist research or promoting feminist research in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and how you've overcome them to continue doing the amazing work that you do?
Thank you very much. The first challenge for us working with the approach that we use it needs a lot of investment in the participants themselves in order to build the capacity into the research itself. So you need a lot of effort, time to invest in them. And the second one is the ongoing mentoring. We work with ongoing mentoring approach with the young women or women, as most of we take half those who have been into academic environment and half who are non-academic. So we have ongoing mentoring. We need a lot of, it's not just money, but effort and time that you need to put into make them really own with most of adolescents and young women who have experienced gender-based self-esteem, building them to have their own self-esteem before they can own the process. The other challenge is with the transition from having the results of the research and the outreach activities. I would just quickly in 30 seconds talk about the outreach. We go in communities to collect data, and we will promise them to come back with the findings of the research. So during the outreach, we then bring back the findings of the research. You need to put the key findings to be understandable by the community. So to say time, effort to make the approach very efficient, but sometimes you also find resistance of academics who feel like non-academics generated data are not good enough until it is endorsed by certain academics. So to sum up, those will be challenges that we meet in the partnership now with beliefs into feminist approach as a tool for generating knowledge that brings social change. Like I said earlier, we've worked in 4 research from the mining to sexual reproductive health, economic empowerment, sexual and humanitarian environment. They have seen that final conclusions of those 4 work have suggested more sustainable and practical solutions to the issue. So now we have some academics buying in. Hello?
Thanks, Annie. That was great. There was some bits that were a little robotic, but I think we really understood everything you were saying. And you pointed out 2 or 3 really fantastic challenges and things that are really important to think about when we set off to do feminist research. Victoria, if you're back online and you can hear us, yes, I think you are. So it would be great if you wanted to just wrap up this part of the conversation, either by adding any final words that you didn't get to say earlier, or telling us about, you know, what you see as the main challenge undertaking feminist research in your context.
Okay, I will talk about the challenges. So I think one of the greatest challenges I've encountered is the language. Language is a big problem because, for instance, some concepts cannot be translated locally to have the same meaning as it would be in English. So when you translate it locally, you either lose the meaning or it creates some kind of resistance within the communities, because people have a bias. People have a bias. For instance, even if you told me to translate feminist into Luganda, it would be very hard for me. I'm actually thinking through, and it's very hard. So even in the communities where people don't speak English, where you'd love to communicate in the language they understand the best, it's very hard to make that. Then the other thing is the misconceptions. We continue to have misconceptions in relation to feminist research. People tend to refer to it as, you know, in quotes, women's things. Others call it the foreign things. Others call it things for the spoiled women. So it's like there's a negative attitude towards feminist research. And because of that, it creates resistances within the communities, and it makes research generally hard. So you'll find men refusing, you won't talk to my wife, you won't talk to my wife about those things. So there's still a lot that needs to be done to change the perceptions people have in relation to feminist research, and also finding the best way to communicate through the local dialects, the local languages that people think through. Because if you're talking to someone in English, maybe some things will just pass, but if you speak things in the language they normally use, then you'll communicate in a better way.
Thank you so much, Vicky. I think many of us are familiar with those negative connotations, and definitely it's something that we need to work through in order to ensure our work reaches as many people as possible. So I'm gonna say a huge thank you to Annie and Vicky now for joining us in this conversation, but they're not leaving, obviously. They are here for our next part of the session, which is the Q&A. Next slide, thank you. So this is really open, and it's for everyone who's on the call and who's joined us today to ask questions about what feminist research is, how it's done. If you have any very practical questions about some of the work that Annie or Vicky are doing, they are here to answer your question, and so are Alina and I, of course. So we'd like us to go back to any of the principles we talked about at the start and ask any clarifications. This is the opportunity to do so. As we said at the start, you can raise your hand if you have figured out how to do that on Zoom, or you can just type in the chat saying, I want to ask a question, and we'll unmute you. Alternatively, feel free to just write your question in the chat. And if you don't have a question, but you have an experience you'd like to share, a frustration you'd like to have heard, please feel free to come forward with those as well. So the floor is open.
And I think, Ilaria, while we're waiting, Zorika, I don't know if I hope I'm saying your name correctly, but when introducing ourselves, she had mentioned ways to spice up the feminist perspective in field-based rapid gender analysis. So that might be something that Annie or Vicky have ideas about.
Yeah, absolutely. Annie, Vicky, if you have any thoughts about how to, infuse a feminist perspective when we do quick assessments in humanitarian development settings, quick, rapid gender analysis, and things like that, we'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Hello, this is Annie here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Okay. My first suggestion when people do a quick assessment is always to not. I always suggest that to not have in the mind that we're doing to do things for the beneficiaries. This creates a sort of separation or misunderstanding of their reality. It's always important to include at least some representative of the community where the program will be going to be implemented. It is very important, and also to just consider diversity of the people who intervene in your assessment, because most of the time we do not always consider that diversity, and it has problems during implementation of humanitarian responses. Sometimes what is suggested is not always fit with the needs, given the lack of diversity of the stakeholders who are involved in the assessment moment. So I'll leave Vicky to also bring a suggestion.
Vicky, feel free to jump in if you can hear us.
Yeah, I can hear you. I was actually just thinking about always prioritizing the context under which we are operating. I'll give an example of northern Uganda, where there was some humanitarian agency that was giving out some assistance, and it was looking at household heads. They centered household heads, but in the local context, household heads are men. And these men are at times polygamous. So if you consider the household head, you leave out like several families. You might leave out several families, because then for them, they'll consider who they think maybe needs whatever you're giving out. So we realized in the end that some of the families were not receiving because the men were just choosing who to give. So the humanitarian agencies were being advised to at least look at the female heads within the households, because a man can have like 3 women, and if you just call out the man, that means you're missing out on 2 of the women.
Thank you so much, Vicky, and really great points about making sure we're understanding the context and we tailor our work to them. There are two really great questions in the chat. So the first question is from Heather. She asks, as a researcher, I'm curious as to how emotions figure into research, and if this is something that can be focused on when doing large-scale projects. And if so, how this is incorporated into research. So either Vicky or Annie, if you have any thoughts about how you have worked with or you've thought about emotions in your research work, that would be really great to hear. And then the other question, as you think about that, the other question is specifically for Annie. If you could please talk a little bit about how you structure the training and support for the girls that you worked with, particularly the training around data interpretation and analysis. So feel free to answer whatever question you want to answer first.
Okay, I think my question will complete each other. On emotions, I'm going to mix. I think Sophie will also get some answers as I speak. We already structured the group of the young women. We had specific mentors. So for mentors, we have also had done a mapping of other stakeholders who had some specific supports, like psychology, counseling, and others who give some trainings. But we had also planned on giving them specific sessions on maybe communication, on a lot of various were meant to build them personally. So mentors had weekly sessions with their mentees. The mentees were researchers. So when it was research work, they were considered to be experts. But when it was on the personal development, that's why I talked about the cost being one of the challenge that we dealt with to make the approach very efficient, because we had to invest in them having personal coach, having mentors, and then having trainings. But we also had a referral, a referencing system whereby when we noted that the emotional problem the girl researcher was dealing with was 2 ways bigger than the mentor could handle, then we would reference them to a service provider who is providing the kind of support that the young women need. Give an example of one young woman who was a victim of domestic violence. But we had to create sort of, how can I call it, shelter, make her move from where she was living, but then reference her to benefit from some counseling through a different stakeholders. So I will insist on saying that the approach we used was also to consider input of other stakeholders. So we had a map of multi-stakeholders with different services that they were giving. So I think I've answered the emotion side of it, but it's very important to make a clear line between what's the technical work they have to do and what is the other support that you are giving to them, so you can avoid them influencing the data they are going to collect in order to have data that is really of the quality. So how we structured training around interpretation. Yes, I said earlier that we had young women who did not go to school, so we used audio. We have to consider a range of tools. We used audio guides to help them conduct the data collection and the recording. The mentors also had a second responsibility of transcription, because some data came in local language. I will then second Vicky on the challenge of local language. And what we did also was from the beginning to develop a sort of a glossary for us to have the same understanding of what each word meant when it was in the local language and what was that in French or Lingala. So once again, this was an ongoing work. We did not wait until we're going to collect data to start translating. No, this was a weekly process where mentors were translating data as we moved on, and we gave back the participant opportunity. That was what they said on. Am I here still?
Yeah,
Hello?
we heard
Okay.
most of it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Annie. So we're just conscious of the time, so I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up this part of the conversation. But please do, of course, feel free to reach out to us and to our wonderful guests. A huge thank you to Dr. Naugala and Annie Modi for joining us today. It's been such a fantastic conversation, and we really appreciate you taking the time to share your knowledge and expertise with us. Next slide, we're just going to wrap up really quickly with a couple of key takeaway messages and a goodbye from COFEM, since this is the last session of the Knowledge Summit. Here we had a question just for us to think about in terms of how we want to engage going forward as a community, not just within COFEM, but for all of you who joined us who are not members of COFEM. So, you know, if you have thoughts about how we can collectively promote feminist methods and approaches in research on violence against women and girls, do get in touch with us, and we'll go through the details of how to do that at the very end of today's presentation. So handing over to Alina for a couple of last words. Alina?
Sorry, I did not unmute myself. We would like to share a few key takeaways, as we have absorbed a lot, and I think we'll all continue to reflect and re-listen. The first takeaway is that feminist research is not only research about women, it is emancipatory, both in its process and in its intended outcome. Next slide. The second is to summarize the defining features that we spoke about at the beginning. First, that women and girls' perspectives and lived experiences are valued and centered in feminist research. Second, that it incorporates a structural analysis, looking across the individual, social, systemic, and institutional changes necessary to achieve gender equality. And finally, that it includes a political lens in which existing inequalities are challenged through the research process, as well as the analysis, generation, and application of findings. And I'll just say, I think, you know, our third key takeaway here can be in the process itself, which is that it's really important to seek each other out and share and listen, because we really can inspire each other and learn from each other along the way. Next slide, please. So taking a closer look, feminist research on a very practical level is really vital to ensuring that GBV programming and policies are grounded in women and girls' realities and in transformative approaches to preventing and responding to GBV. So it is not something that's for, you know, that belongs on a shelf or just in some kind of dusty journal, but it really is central to what we do as activist scholars, to borrow Vicky's term, and as practitioners, and whatever we identify with in the work that we do. And just to say, art is also important inspiration, and this drawing is by my friend Pau, who's a street artist. I really encourage you to check out her work. Next slide, please. So we want to leave you with some additional resources. We have a reading list, and there's a few guides on the left, including the tip sheet 5, which this session is based off of, a guide for research, feminist research put out by the institute that I work with. So that's free online. We welcome your feedback even in making it better if you have any questions. and a great book to get your hands on called Doing Feminist Research in Political and Social Science. And then on the left, it's a little, the formatting is a little messed up, but there are examples here of some of the work that Annie has done with the La Pépinière project, and Vicky as well. And there's plenty more to read out there from both of them. And then an interesting kind of debate blog to also get some thoughts started there. So next slide, please. And Laurie, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much. So a couple of final requests from us. I have pasted in the chat a link that you can use to provide feedback on this session and on the whole Knowledge Summit if you've attended more than one session. We'd really love to hear feedback. This was the first time that COFEM puts together an event of this size and breadth, and you know, we hope it was useful, but we definitely want to keep doing things that are helpful for feminists doing important work on violence against women and girls out there. So please do share your feedback and your thoughts on how we can do it better next time. And next slide, here are some links for you to keep in touch with COFEM. We have a Twitter page that's quite active, a brand new website that we really encourage you to visit if you haven't already, and a LinkedIn profile. And if you want any information, including information about how to join COFEM, please do email us at the email there, info@cofemsocialchange.org. So with that, last slide, a huge thank you to everyone who has joined us today, to everyone who's joined us for previous Knowledge Summit sessions. I've seen some names coming up every time, which is really encouraging and really wonderful to see. We hope you found the sessions interesting. We hope you find the COFEM Feminist Pocketbook useful in your work, and we're always happy to take suggestions for new resources that might help you in your work. So a huge thank you to all participants, and of course a huge thank you to Annie and Vicky for joining us today and sharing their wisdom with us. Thank you so much, and see you online.
Thank you, everyone.